Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. We're bringing you the latest news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Yin Khvat. Here's what's coming up.
女王がおっしゃるように、民主主義や法の支配といった価値観を共有する日米の役割はますます大きくなっていると感じています。
Fumio, Kishida and Joe Biden say the Japan-U.S. alliance is of utmost importance at a point in history when the world order is under threat. Then,
if there's no U.S. commitment whatsoever, we estimate that it would take about 2 or 3 months for China to conquer Taiwan if Taiwan resisted to the best of its ability.
A Washington think tank ran a Chinese invasion scenario by land and sea 24 times and found mostly it would need the U.S., Japan and Taiwan to work together to defeat Beijing, but at huge cost. Also,
the free world has shown impressive unity in response to the war in Ukraine. Any attempt by China to change the status quo in Taiwan by force should spark an equally unified response. And we must make this clear to China now.
A former NATO Secretary-General rallies the support of the democratic world for Taiwan. We look at the impact. Plus, one of the first things the newly minted U.S. Speaker of the House did is to establish a China Select Committee. It's the only single-country committee in the House. And
I'd be cautious about reading too much into Qin Gong's either appointment as foreign minister or some of his recent statements. I mean, I think the assumption may be that his appointment as foreign minister maybe signals an intention of improving U.S.-China relationships. Is perhaps a bit disingenuous.
Drew Thompson takes a look ahead to see what's in store for Taiwan in 2023. Welcome to the show. I'm Yin Khvat. Our guests today are Raymond Song, Taiwan New Constitution Foundation Deputy CEO and an expert in international relations, and Albert Cho, Donghai University Professor of Political Science and an expert in Taiwan-U.S. relations. And from Singapore, I spoke with Drew Thompson, a visiting senior research fellow at National University of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Drew is a former director for China, Taiwan and Mongolia in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs at the U.S. Department of Defense. He's also a part-time senior research scientist at national security think tank CNA Corporation. Raymond, Albert, very warm welcome to the show today. Today, we begin with the deepening security relationship between Japan and the United States. Fumio Kishida said his meeting on January 13th with Joe Biden in Washington came at a historic turning point. He said the free, open and stable world order established post the Cold War was under threat. Biden also called this a historic time and said the US and Japan had never been closer. That evening, Kishida addressed Johns Hopkins University. Let's see what he said.
日本は世界の平和と繁栄や自由で開かれた国際秩序を能動的に作り出していく決意であるということ。第3に、このような世界を作り出していく努力の中で、米国と日本は最も重要な同盟国、親友であり、我々の絆を強めていく必要があるということ。
In the same speech, Kishida said Japan's upgraded defense strategy represented, quote, one of the most historically critical milestones for strengthening the U.S.-Japan alliance following such precedents as the conclusion of the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty by Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru. Albert, let me start with you. So why is the 2022 Japan's national defense strategy such a critical milestone in the U.S.-Japan security alliance?
Okay, first of all, I would like to address a little bit about Kishida's visit to the United States, also met up with Joe Biden. I think Kishida needed this very bad. given the fact that his approval rating in the domestic Japanese society has been plummeting. And he needs that to kind of build up a new zone to win over some hearts of some of the Japanese citizens. That's number one.
So domestic politics was in play here.
Sure, I mean, so does the situation in the United States too. Number two is that ever since the Ukrainian war broke out last year, Japan was aware of the possibility and also it's approaching that there might be a war, around the corner in the Taiwan Strait between Taiwan and China. So Japan was fundamentally changed. That I call as a momentous shift from as a pacifist nation, not anymore that. We all knew the history of Japan in World War II, and there is a certain constitutional limitation on the on having force. Not to mention have this formal military build up in the nation of Japan. So, but now
let me just bring in Raymond,
sure.
because Japan would still say that it is defensive.
Formally, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, the constitutional status does not change.
Okay.
Yeah, but just in facing a new threat, changing challenges, they need to have a new strategic outlook and to have the capability to fulfill those tasks.
Right. Well, I mean, it's defensive, of course. I mean, Japan will never say that it's going to be aggressive, right? But it's going to be defensive in a different definition, in that the target now is clearly China. And Taiwan is part of the whole picture. And the United States is not to mention, it's the one who is conducting the whole thing from behind the scene, right? So I think we can tell from Kishida's words that Japan is a different country now. But we also do not want to see a Japan develop in a way that sort of out of control in direction of Jingoism. But I don't believe that in such a modern and democratic country now Japan would walk in that direction. So for those people in Taiwan who are pessimistic or just kind of look down to Japan in terms of that dimension, can kind of feel relaxed a little bit. That's kind of my first comment.
Yeah, I think if the country which most worry about that, if there's any, is the United States. But as we see from the Kishida meeting,
So not China.
Not China. Well, there's a complex history here, but I think if the United States are comfortable with this, I think there's no problem of that. Actually, there's no possibility. The emphasis, the whole emphasis about that, the security situation Japan is facing, about the North Korea threats from North Korea, China, and the Russia Federation, and all three are nuclear powers. And so for that, and also they intensify the military activities surrounding Japan. So in facing that new strategic situation, what should Japan do? Actually, the current, the 2022 amendment or the new documents are the culmination of the long series of developments to free up the rooms of operation for the self-defense forces for Japan and to increase and strengthen its own capabilities to doing that. So I think I agree with Albert fully that the emphasis is still about defense, defending Japan itself.
And actually there has been quite a lot of propaganda coming out of China, North Korea, Russia in trying to attack Japan's basic boost to self-defense.
I think the starting point, we need to make that clear after the World War II, the self-defense team. There's no formally army in Japan. They can only perform passive self-defense, not active or anticipatory, not at all. And in the current situation, you need certain capability to defend yourselves. For example, if missile attack, actually that also happened already. The overflow of North Korean missiles and the falling of the Chinese missiles in the Japanese EEZ.
After Nancy Pelosi's visit.
Yes. So they need some kind of capability to deter those happening again.
Let's move on to how the relationship is changing very briefly. Raymond, so it's as critical as when Japan and US signed the first security treaty in the 1950s.
Yes.
Okay, so is this a change in the relationship between the two? Previous to this, it was the US basically providing the security arrangements for Japan.
Yes. Yes, okay. The military alliance between the United States and Japan is a cornerstone of the Indo-Pacific security arrangements, and all through history it's playing a bigger role now. And that it has experienced several stages that we've been witnessing the change in the following four aspects: the source of the threat and the geographical coverage of these alliance, and the responses and limits put on the forces, and the loosening of self-defense of Japan. In the early era, before 1960s, the imagination is that the threat will come from Russia, and but in later years, it's more and more putting on the threats from North Korea and China, and especially Taiwan is put into the surrounding areas, which of concern of the Japan's security, and now it's even more that after 2012. Actually, and also starting from 1996, the military missile exercise against Taiwan, and Taiwan's being put to a situation which will concern the survival of Japan. And in the latest document, it says if an attack toward a friendly nation, which is of particular security concern of Japan, the third country, that Japan will be able to resort to self-defense, including not only in providing aid and logistics support for the U.S. military, but in also involving the limited exercises taken by the Japanese force itself. So which means that the attack on Taiwan is a concern for survival for the Japanese, based on several reasons. First is the geographical vicinity of military bases of Japan and Okinawa and Japanese island with Taiwan. The second reason is the location of military bases in Japan, which will definitely be involved if Taiwan contingency happens. So for those reasons, Japan is viewing Taiwan's attack being a matter for survival for Japan itself.
Albert, this matter of survival, and as Raymond mentioned, there was a change in the US defense posture in the Marines, announced just days ahead of the Biden-Kishida summit, and it's to do with the 12th Regiment, which is based in Okinawa. They will turn into a literal, what's called a literal regiment, which is, hard to detect, fast-moving, and efficient fighting force for the shore areas. Why is this significant?
Right. I mean, this change, especially involving a structural adjustment, it's been very curious to some of the observers like us, right? Some criticism or critiques against this adjustment who kind of does not like the United States and also the U.S. Japanese alliance would say that this is kind of descale, kind of scale down a little bit, scale back the size and also the structure of the U.S. military occupation in that area. However, to me, the restructure is quite opposite. It's actually upscale. It's actually increased the size and also, reveal the strengthened intention of the U.S. to take care of this region. Why? I actually did a little research of this. I saw some documents kind of indicative of the change as a reconstitutes the 12th Marine Regiment to become the 12th Marine Littoral Regiment. It's actually, make it, a change in the direction of a more lethal force that can move quietly than the region with anti-ship missions, advanced radar, and could be a key whenever there's a conflict between Japan and China. That means that the whole attack against China used to be, if the Marine Corps remain in the old form, will be only from ground to sea, or maybe at the best from sea to sea. But now could be from ground to air, from air to air, from sea to sea, and so on. So it becomes more mobile and more lethal and quietly and rapidly too.
Yes.
And Raymond, would it mean that the Marines can come onto Taiwan shores?
I think it's mainly for defense of Japan, right? And it's about the U.S. Japanese alliance and the command system within that. I think the key for those are they are putting up an integrated alliance posture between those two forces, and for that, for some common tasks, they need centralized or they need to integrate their command system together. So the key words again is interoperable capabilities building.
Washington think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, has found that in a conventional Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan, in most scenarios, United States, Taiwan, and Japan would be victorious. However, this win would come at a high cost. The United States and its allies would lose tens of thousands of service members. Taiwan's economy would be devastated. The U.S. global position would be damaged for many years, and China would also lose heavily. In addition, Beijing's failure may destabilize Chinese Communist Party rule. Let's hear from one of the report's authors.
First, Taiwan must resist. If Taiwan capitulates immediately upon invasion, like Denmark or Thailand did in World War II, then there's nothing that the U.S. can do in order to reverse that capitulation. Second, the U.S. must quickly commit its own forces to direct combat operations against China. If there's no U.S. commitment whatsoever, we estimate that it would take about 2 or 3 months for China to conquer Taiwan if Taiwan resisted to the best of its abilities, but that success on China's part is inevitable. There's no Ukraine model for a Taiwan war. We can't simply try to resupply Taiwan and give them weapons during the war, because China will be able to intercept any sort of shipment. And any delay or hesitance on the U.S. parts only increases both casualties and the chances of Chinese success. Third, the U.S. must conduct operations out of its bases in Japan. The U.S. is legally required to consult with Japan before its employment of combat forces, and should that consultation not result in U.S. forces, particularly tactical aviation, operating out of Japan, then the U.S. intervention would not be enough to continue Taiwan's autonomy. Any delay, and finally, the U.S. must have sufficient stockpiles of long-range anti-ship munitions, principally air-launched anti-ship cruise missiles. With thousands of these, it becomes a much simpler task, and there will be many fewer U.S. casualties.
That was Matthew Kansian, one of the report's authors at CSIS. Albert, so just very briefly, let's talk about this war games from the angle of Japan, and then Raymond, if you can address China. So we've spoken about Japan. The wargaming actually showed that Okinawan bases as well as Guam would get destroyed in the first few days. So what do you think Japan takes away from this, briefly?
Well, I mean, the United States had 2 bases in Okinawa and Guam. Of course, that's going to be a ideal target for China.
So
right?
If the U.S. didn't have bases there, if Japan refused to have U.S. bases there?
Well, then that would change the game a little bit, in a sense that China would choose other targets for their priority, right? But also, if there are 2 bases, in the 2 islands, that means that Japan is part of the game. They are in. Right? So it's hard for them to get away from this war scenario, which I think is good, because for Taiwan, we need an environment where we invite other airlines, however informal they are, be in the game. We kind of fight as a team to go against China.
Okay, Raymond, let's leave China to one side. Let's go into the detail of the report. What was, what did you take away from this war games?
Okay, may I just say a little bit about the fundamental aspects of war game? Actually, the war game is conducted for decision makers to test their weaknesses and the vulnerability and the consequences of their decision made. So they need to have all those 24 scenarios to to clearly show to the decision maker what's the implication of their current determination and decisions. And secondly, about the tested capabilities and the vulnerability of the forces currently. So the CSIS report, they detailed very much clearly about the source of information and the basis of those information data. And thirdly, the war game CSIS is about the situation of war between Chinese and the U.S. and the allied forces over a Taiwan contingency. So, of course, Albert is absolutely correct that all three parties, U.S., Japan, and Taiwan, are involved. And but it's not for the mainly addressing Taiwan's forces. It's mainly addressed to the U.S. weaknesses and U.S. forces. So we see the key conditions that you just showed to us. That, for example, U.S. should use the bases in Japan and to quickly respond and to intervene and to strengthen its stockpile of long-range missile to attack naval platform of China. So understanding those, that we will not put so much emphasis on the actual consequences or who wins and who loses or the losses. Actually, those are just consequences. But the point is to, judging from the current situation, how a decision maker involved is to perfecting or improve its own decisions, and also the emphasis on to better deter possible Chinese invasion. So understanding this, actually, of course, war is terrible, that the cost will be imposed on both sides. But actually, those are of secondary importance if you consider the fundamental or more fundamentally important purpose of a war game.
Albert, so Raymond said these war games are designed to give policymakers direction. What do you think the US will take from this war games?
I think when think tank like CSIS, such a internationally known one, did this, and as we watched from the video clip, that was after 42 rounds, right?
24.
Or 24 rounds of these simulations. That means that to me, because personally I am like a political scientist that use a lot of software and also computer skill to predict this stuff. So that to me, it's very convincing. It's very convincing in two senses. Number one, if the war started very quickly and also ended abruptly, that's gonna only involve the Sea Force and also the Air Force. So that is the silver lining for Taiwan is that the Chinese troop will not land in Taiwan.
No, they said in all cases, Chinese forces did land.
Right, but actually, as I read from the other reports, the CSIS report actually indicates that if the United States can get involved in the very first minutes, then the war can end in that scenario without the invasion in the island of Taiwan. That's how I read it. But anyway, if that's the case, I think it's good because that only involves professional fighters instead of civilians. That's number one. Number two is that I think the CSIS really indicates the needs and also the direction in terms of the arms sale to Taiwan. What kind of weapons the United States should sell to Taiwan? To be specific, the United States would advise Taiwan needs to purchase more anti-ship missiles. That's actually consistent with our conversation early on in the first topic that anti-ship missiles is not only necessary for Japan, but also for Taiwan, because that's after all the major strategy from China to attack Taiwan and even Japan. Right.
Okay. Raymond, would you like to add? I mean, you said that this is really for the US, not for Taiwan.
The main lessons, yes, I will very happy to add. The main lessons is that successful defense of Taiwan is achievable if the three parties work together. And to achieve those, they need several key conditions to be fulfilled. Firstly, Taiwan will not surrender. and that's the most basic condition. The second, that the U.S. forces should act quickly to intervene. The more quicker, the better. And to use the basis in Japan to launch those response. The third one is that the U.S. should strengthening its own capability to attack military or naval vessels carrying the Chinese amphibious attacking forces from a long distance, and they sense the critical shortage of the stockpile on those long-range missiles. And
so this is not to hit China itself. This is just to hit
if the
vessels within this area.
Yes.
Yeah. Because
China the strait. Yes.
Because China will effectively, ensure that there are no, U.S. vessels that can actually come close.
And that's a point for discussion, because in this report they evaluate the Chinese air defense capability very highly. They say actually they effectively saying that the U.S. carriers or fighters will if ever enter into Chinese air defense zone, they will be attacked and be destroyed.
So that's what area denial is, isn't it?
Yeah.
They will be seeking to do this.
So they emphasize the better strategic point to attack Chinese carriers
missiles.
And the fourth one is that Taiwan should prepare for a landing of the Chinese army, no matter in which scenario. There will be some Chinese amphibious attack will be landed on Taiwan. But the key point that if Taiwan did not surrender after the first wave of missile attack, and even after in face of heavy losses and casualties, that all three forces are continuing their fighting, they will win eventually, even though the loss will be high. But the defense of Taiwan is possible and achievable, and Taiwan should continue fighting even after the first wave of attack, even in face of heavy casualties.
Great. Albert, I have a question for you in reflecting everything that Raymond has said. So do you think the US is more or less likely to come to Taiwan's defense?
Well, from my personal observation of the Ukrainian war just happened last year, I do believe that if I were an ordinary American, I certainly do not want to just without too much consideration, I mean, without a thorough calculation, and send my people to fight for a distant lands in Taiwan. Of course, I don't want to do that, but I'm willing to do something to help, because Taiwan is our friend, if from the perspective of Americans. And the point is that this kind of approach was, many people not sure of whether that's going to work or not. But after the experience in the Ukrainian war, we now know that it's going to be working and working really well. So I believe that if there is
except for the fact that in Ukraine, they were able to keep rearming the Ukrainian soldiers, and that's not possible here.
Well, I mean, here we still have what I call a proxy for the United States, for example, Japan. And even Philippines, or even there are offshore islands, close to Japan, can help in the United States to, armor us, and also continuously to provide us necessary assistance. I believe in that. But also, we have bought a lot of stuff, good stuff. I mean, those weapons and also missiles from the United States. When the war did not break out yet. So that get us well prepared. And that's why the CSIS, at the conclusion of this war game, still advised Taiwanese government to weaponize ourselves as a porcupine. And that's regardless what party is going to be in power in Taiwan, always have to think in that way, because that's pretty much the only way that we can protect ourselves.
Okay. Taiwan has received its first official trip by a former NATO Secretary-General. Anders Fogh Rasmussen said he visited Taiwan to declare his full support for freedom, democracy, and the right of Taiwanese to decide their own future in peace. He drew a parallel between Taiwan and Ukraine. Let's take a look.
All those who believe in a democratic Taiwan and a rules-based international order must work to ensure Ukraine prevails. It is for the people of Ukraine and the people of Taiwan to decide on their own futures. The free world must give them our support.
That was Anders Fogh Rasmussen, a former NATO chief. Raymond, how significant is a visit by an ex-NATO Secretary-General to Taiwan, and what are the implications of Rasmussen?
I think it's very significant. Actually, we've been witnessing the linkage between NATO and cross-Atlantic alliance and the Indo-Pacific building of alliances remarkably. Actually, Japan is very putting much effort into bringing those two together, and now we see the visit of a former NATO secretary to Taiwan, which is also another witness evidence of this developing the trend. And of course, the security situations faced between Taiwan and Ukraine was brought together, and of course, the implication is very clear that both countries are facing an expansionist regime of a dictatorship, and the risk of military conflict is really, really high.
Does it increase, democratic nations around the world? Does it make them want to support Taiwan more?
I think so. Actually, also, this only the latest development in a long series of developments. So, of course, the security situation of Taiwan is also has also been noticed by the East European countries like Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine itself, and also by our friends in Europe.
On that point, Albert, Rasmussen actually said that he doesn't want Europe to send any mixed messages over Taiwan to China. So is it clear that Europe would sanction China after an invasion?
Well, I mean, the cost of sanctioning China on the parts of Europe is economy, right? Just as much as when Germany wanted to sanction Russia, and it causes that the cutoff of the energy and also the gas, transported to Germany. So I think he's very straightforward in this, that if the whole European countries or these democracies in the European continents want to stand by Taiwan, they have to be ready for any kind of necessary costs they will need to endure. But that's going to be valuable and meaningful if the red supply chain is going to be cut off from the European requirements. And that's a way for those European friends to think about.
Raymond, let's now turn to the idea of NATO and Taiwan. Yeah. So the Ministry of National Defense has now admitted that they actually send one military personnel to a NATO defense college every year for 6 months.
Oh, right.
How significant is this?
I think Taiwan should diversify its training sources. Actually, instead of having totally on the United States military academies to train its officers, we should diversify the sources of receiving those trainings. And also, much is to be learned from NATO, actually, from how a regime of collective self-defense is operating and how they coordinate the forces between different countries. And actually, the more internationalized the Taiwanese force, the better I would suggest, yes.
Albert, so an internationalized force, as Raymond said, for Taiwan, would this be used in practice?
I think that in the near future, and even in the distant future, we'll see more delegations coming to Taiwan from Europe. And I'm not going to be very surprised about that. But just like what I mentioned early on in this show, I always suggest that the delegation, in and out, is not good enough. We really have to find an institutionalized mechanism built up between Taiwan and also other countries, and to make sure that the visit becomes part of their law, in whatever sense, regarding human rights, regarding the the value of democracy, that we are on the same page. So I think that's what we need to work on for Taiwan.
Okay. After 15 rounds of voting in the U.S. House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy was selected as Speaker of a Republican-controlled House. One of the first things McCarthy did was to put to the vote a new China Select Committee devoted to addressing the many threats from Beijing. It was adopted overwhelmingly in a bipartisan vote with 365 in favour and 65 opposed. All Republicans and 146 Democrats joined them to back the venture. The vote was the first significant moment of cooperation in a new Congress that has so far been marked by Republican infighting and Democratic resistance. So the chair of the China Select Committee will be Representative Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin, who is a leading voice in the Republican Party on China issues. Now, Gallagher said the panel will expose the Chinese Communist Party's, quote, coordinated whole of society strategy to undermine American leadership and American sovereignty while working on a bipartisan basis to look at long overdue common sense approaches to counter CCP aggressions. Albert, given that this select committee's powers will be largely investigative and not legislative, to what extent can it shape U.S.-China policy?
Well, I mean, on the Capitol Hill, of course, congressional persons or members of Congress still can make impact on the State Departments, even on the Pentagon, not to mention the Oval Office, in terms of change, structure, or bias, if you will, direction of the foreign policies. So I, personally, actually, one of my projects in my hand is to study the members of Congress and also their influence in foreign policies. And that's number one. So they do have some influence over there. Number two is that, we all knew that Kevin McCarthy just had an experience of the difficulty in getting elected. Some of his own fellows suspicious of him did not think that he's in line with Trump that much. But finally he won, right? So he had a very difficult situation, and he needs something to kind of call people together to show that now I'm the one who can command. And Taiwan is one of the few issues out there he can work on. So that's, to me, he will continue to work on that and work it hard.
Raymond, so, bipartisan agreement on Taiwan against China. So how likely do you think is a McCarthy visit to Taiwan? Would this also give him, that bipartisan control that he needs?
I don't know. I don't know. We need a careful assessment after Pelosi's visit. Of course, as Taiwanese, we welcome the visit of a high-level, the Speaker of the House, to visit Taiwan to show his support to Taiwan. But we also hope that those will not be used against Taiwan's interests as an excuse. And actually, the whole Pelosi episode is a little bit awkward in the sense that much of it is to be made up by China to try to emphasize this importance so heavily to incite their nationalist feelings within China. And after the visit did come true, that there being hugely popular discontent to suppress. And
so you're saying it actually plays into China's hands too?
And
as an excuse to incite
on purpose by the Chinese authority and Xi Jinping. Unfortunately, I think actually China is not acting as a responsible or reasonable partner in this issue. I hope this won't be repeated on part of China, I mean. Actually, Taiwan and the U.S. made it very clear that it's no taboo and no break away from the U.S. one China policy for elected, the leader of the elected institution of America to visit Taiwan. It's within the U.S. policy of the people's exchanges. So there's no point to make such a fuss about it.
Raymond Song and Albert Cho, thank you so much for joining Taiwan Talks today. Now, while the world is just starting a new year, will 2023 bring any change to the struggles of last year? For our extended interview, I speak to Drew Thompson. Drew Thompson is a visiting senior research fellow at National University of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Drew is a former director for China, Taiwan and Mongolia in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs at the U.S. Department of Defense. He is also a part-time senior research scientist at national security think tank CNA Corporation. Let's take a look. Drew, what do you make of the new Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang's remarks, where he said that he was deeply impressed by the hardworking, friendly, and talented Americans that he had met during his time in Washington?
I'd be cautious about reading too much into Qin Gang's either appointment as foreign minister or some of his recent statements. I mean, I think the assumption may be that his appointment as foreign minister maybe signals an intention of improving U.S.-China relationships is perhaps a bit disingenuous. It's really his close relationship with Xi Jinping that is the defining qualification for his promotion. And I think personally a more powerful signal of a desire to improve the relationship would probably acting to actually resolve some of the policy differences between the U.S. and China, whether that's the treatment of foreign investors in China, creating a more level economic playing field, or just plain increasing transparency in Beijing. I'd be much more pleased to see that sentiment reflected in Chinese media, covering more positive aspects of U.S. culture and politics and people, rather than the very relentless negative treatment of the U.S. and maybe Europe and other countries more generally in Chinese media. It's just such consistently negative reporting that public opinion towards the U.S. is negative, and it becomes what we used to call in the Pentagon a self-licking ice cream cone, where Chinese officials say, well, we can't make concessions to the U.S. because public opinion is so negative towards the U.S., when in fact it's the Chinese propaganda authorities who are driving this negative perception, and it's well within their power to change it.
One of the things that Qin Gang did say was that if China had known that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, then China would have tried to stop Russia. Now, of course, he's going to become foreign minister, and China can still try to stop Russia. Do you see any sort of changes in this direction, perhaps in 2023?
I mean, I'd point out that Qin Gang and the foreign minister is not a decision maker in the Chinese political system. I think China sees a strong, positive, constructive relationship between Beijing and Moscow as critical for China's own security, as a bulwark against what it calls the West, that it sees as a very hostile, though critical partner for Beijing. And I don't see that shifting. I don't see China walking away from its relationship, nor do I see Xi Jinping using whatever leverage they may have with Russia to bring an end to the conflict, or to pressure Moscow to withdraw its troops from occupied territories, including the Crimea and Donbass and the other occupied territories. So I think it's not enough just to call on all sides to broker peace. We've seen a lot of the Chinese messaging placing blame on the U.S. and on NATO, which is not the case. It's very clear that Russia is the aggressor here. And ultimately, China has chosen its interests over its principles.
What do you think 2023 will bring Ukraine?
I mean, that's tough to predict. I mean, obviously, we're looking now at a protracted conflict. I think there's limits to what Ukraine can do. I think there's limits to the amount of support that NATO can provide. So the likelihood of a quick victory by Ukraine is probably low. I think Russia is clearly committed to putting more men in the fight, more material. They're not limited yet, but obviously their military is under considerable strain. They've had significant losses, but both sides have. I think we're going to continue to see China supporting Russia, the U.S. supporting NATO, and the U.S. and NATO supporting Ukraine.
The U.S. finds itself in a position where it is it has two enemies now, you know, China as well as Russia. Do you think this is incredibly significant?
So I don't think we're in particularly extraordinary times. There's definitely a number of crises that the U.S. has to navigate, whether that's Russia, Ukraine. But I mean, let's also keep in mind that Russia is deeply involved in a number of global conflicts and potential conflicts. It's got troops on the ground in Syria, along with the U.S., and there's a continuing effort to deconflict those forces. Russia is also involved in the Balkans, which we're seeing increasing tension with Kosovo in particular, expressing frustration with Russian interference. So I think we have to deal with many different aspects of Russian foreign policy, Chinese foreign policy, whether that's in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, or China's influence globally. These are core issues that the U.S. deals with and has dealt with, I would say, in differing degrees of success over the last 70 years, and it'll continue to do so. And I don't think anything has fundamentally changed that would lead me to believe that the U.S. is not able to handle. As long as the U.S. continues to manage and maintain its alliances and its partnerships, it will be well placed to deal with these global challenges.
There are some analysts who say that China has so many domestic issues at the moment that, they won't cause trouble over Taiwan in 2023. What's your view?
Historically, though, I think China has not initiated any external conflicts to distract its population from its internal problems. I think if you look, it's really the other way around. It's foreign forces taking advantage of China's domestic weakness to impose themselves on China. But that said, there could be a political rationale, particularly from Xi Jinping's perspective. There's the risk that he perceives a threat, and that would justify the initiation of a chain of events that would be intended to force unification. And I think that political risk that he perceives, and that could be in the form of, say, pressure from other Communist Party elites, other leaders, that could supersede all of these other long-standing domestic, what they call contradictions, essentially forcing Xi Jinping's hand to accomplish the Taiwan unification goal despite unresolved domestic problems. So I think this, in essence, is really the great political risk that we face with China today, going forward. It's the capacity, the lack of transparency, the personalization of power, decision-making in Xi Jinping, in his personal circle, that really makes it impossible to predict outcomes using sort of a national interest framework, when in fact it's really Xi Jinping's interests themselves that will define those policy outcomes in China for probably the next 10 years.